701, I'm sorry, to request a kill. It is 3000 and back off Mike, actually I'm in altitude, descend to maintain 1000. 72010, descend to maintain 2000, I got you long clear. I'm sorry, to request a kill. It is 3000 and back off Mike, actually I'm in altitude, descend to maintain 1000.
Coming now. Easy right turn.
Army 72010, descend to maintain 2000, I got you long clear.
Hi, I'm Paul T. Carter coming to you from Thailand. Thank you for joining me. A small body of historians and philosophers claim that the old adage, history repeats itself, is simply not true. The story I'm going to tell you here would support their contention because the Ravens were an anomaly of war. Their role, their mission, their circumstances had never happened before and almost certainly will never happen again. While most Americans watched the Vietnam War on television, another bloody conflict was transpiring next door, hidden from the news cameras and print journalists. A very small select group of volunteer U.S. Air Force pilots in a highly secret U.S. government program were fighting a secret war, wearing civilian clothes, piloting small, prop-driven aircraft, taking life and death risks on every hazardous mission, and given little to no guidance other than to direct deadly fires on the enemy.
I had, of course, served several months in Vietnam with the 25th ARVN Division. It was right after Tet of 68, so things had kind of tapered off a little bit. I really want to do something else. I saw this guy in the bar, and he was wearing civilian clothes, and he had the most wonderful lamb chop sideburns I'd ever seen in my life. And so I was talking to one of my buddies, and I said, well, who's that? And they said, well, that's Captain so-and-so. I said, you're joking. And he said, no, he's in some program, something outside of the country. I don't know what it is. Boom, straight to the bar. I went to him right alongside. I said, I got to find out what you're doing, where you're going. He says, well, I can't tell you everything. And he says, but I can tell you that what you need to do is go get an interview with the commander of the 504th Tactical Air Support Group on the other side of Benoit.
These men were U.S. airborne forward air controllers, called Ravens, guiding fast-mover U.S. fixed-wing fighters and bombers onto enemy targets in an effort to stop the North Vietnamese invasion of Laos. The Raven program came about during the U.S. secret war in Laos, which was fought at the same time as the Vietnam conflict. My video will provide you with a full understanding of the war. In early 1962, the U.S., Soviet Union, and several other countries signed the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos to demilitarize Laos from conflict. As a result, the U.S. pulled its troops from Laos. The North Vietnamese, however, kept 7,000 to 9,000 troops inside Laos in violation of the agreement and continued to expand the Ho Chi Minh Trail complex in the eastern part of Laos as its invasion route into South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were determined to assert sovereignty over Laos and had invaded Laos in 1953 and again in 1959. This time, they stayed. The U.S. was faced with a choice. It could deploy combat troops to Laos and confront the North Vietnamese there, which militarily was the right answer, stopping the North Vietnamese invasion of South Vietnam, or the U.S. could make the choice, which it ultimately did, to place U.S. soldiers at a disadvantage inside South Vietnam to fight North Vietnamese soldiers after the North Vietnamese had gained sanctuary into South Vietnamese jungles, having invaded down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The U.S. had not wanted to publicly violate Lao neutrality and refused to place combat troops in the country. So, instead, the U.S. conducted a secret air war in Laos, bombing the North Vietnamese and their Pathet Lao, Communist Lao, allies from the air. This is where the Ravens came in to prosecute that air war. Assisting the U.S. in Laos was the Royal Lao government, the Hmong forces of General Vang Pao, and the Thai, who had troops, fighters, and other assets in Laos, and assorted Lao tribal allies. And of course, the CIA planned and ran the Lao war under the watchful eye of the U.S. ambassador to Laos, who had the ultimate authority. The real power, however, lay with the Hmong leader Vang Pao, who had been fighting the communist North Vietnamese inside Laos for decades. It was his forces that the U.S. was ultimately supporting.
Well, I met General Vang Pao before I ever flew. The first day I got there. When I was there, they always took the new guy down to meet General Vang Pao the first day, drink three shots of White Horse Scotch. And I was lucky Burr Smith, the CIA operations guy, was there. And I hit it off with him very well at the very beginning and met Vang Pao. I ate dinner with Vang Pao quite often, and I got used to gristle grass and sticky rice and community soup and all that 2-3 times a week. I just loved General Vang Pao. He had so much charisma, and to me, that's who I worked for. I was supporting him. He had so few troops and trying to do with air power what he needed an army for.
That was a war that most of us thought we were doing. We were supporting the Laotians and helping protect their sovereignty from the North Vietnamese invaders. If you ask a bunch of young first lieutenants, the steely-eyed killers that have volunteered for the program, that's what we saw our mission as.
The meals that we were having, this was every evening we'd go down there. There'd be about 50 of the Hmong and, any guests that he had. We were all fighting on the same side. So we'd talk about how the battle had been going today. We would share some White Horse Scotch, and then we would plan the battle for tomorrow.
To prosecute the war from the air, there were two primary campaigns. One was bombing North Vietnamese formations as they were en route to invading South Vietnam on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This bombing campaign was well planned, with U.S. aircraft such as F-4s, F-105s, and A-1Es coming from Thailand, offshore carriers, and South Vietnam to drop ordnance on advancing North Vietnamese troops. The problem was that the bombing was never very effective, and each year the North Vietnamese increased the size of their invasion forces down the trail. The other air campaign is the one that I am describing here, the tactical bombing of invading North Vietnamese forces inside Laos that was attacking Royal Lao, Hmong, and Thai forces and thrusting towards the Thai border.
Each Raven in a way had a specialty. The Ravens that came from NKP, who were used to flying the trail, typically OV-10s or O2s, were very good at finding vehicles because that's what they were looking for on the trail. Others that were good at finding bunkers, for instance. I guess my expertise was finding guns and in bunkers also, because in Vietnam, where I flew, that's what I was looking for. So typically, the Raven would go to the area where he could best use his skill. Obviously there's a lot of crossover. Sometimes I'd find vehicles and you'd try to go after them. Other guys would find guns and we would let each other know where those guns were, as an example, and try to eliminate those threats. We worked very closely among ourselves to determine whose skill was best for what target.
The U.S. and Thai participation in the war was done secretly, so the Thai or even the U.S. could be part of any Air Force it wanted to be.
No, we were also directing Thai aircraft. They weren't Thai, they were Lao. Well, let me put it to you this way. They had sliding grooves in the airplane, and you could slide in whatever marking you wanted on it. And they spent the night in Thailand, and they would fly into Vientiane with Thai markings. They would slide out the Thai markings, slide in Lao, and they would arm the airplanes right there. And there was always an air commando major running the operation there with air commando armors.
You could slide whatever insignia you wanted in there. I flew with American, Thai, Lao, and South Vietnamese flags in there, but I seldom used any of them.
Combat fires, what civilians would call bombing, requires FACs, forward air controllers, to determine the area to strike, regardless if it is naval gunfire, Army artillery fires, or aircraft fires. Trained FACs are required to identify a target, mark the target with some type of easily recognizable munition, meaning showing the fighters where the target is. Then, after the first rounds come in, adjust those rounds towards the target. And then, after the target is engaged, assess battle damage to determine if the target requires reattacking. Many of the Ravens' targets were targets of opportunity, others pre-planned due to the telltale signs of enemy activity the day before.
Maybe there wasn't diverted air available for that day, so you work with the CIA folks and you order it up as a pre-planned target the following day or the day after. In the morning, we would know what pre-plans were coming our way, the call signs of the fighter and approximately what time. And so we would be up flying in that area, not directly over the target, but probably off the side so you don't give it away that we know you're there. As the fighters checked in and as they got closer, the first thing you do is you have them try to see you. Our bird dogs had a big red stripe across the top of the wing. Once they called the FAC in sight, then we would then roll in, throw down a white phosphorus rocket. The reason white phosphorus, you had green background and a big white puff. And then you made a correction off of that where the rocket hit, direct the airstrike. And typically what would happen is that lead would roll in, he would drop his bomb, and then you'd make a correction for two of where the lead's bomb hit 10 meters farther on or to the right or to the left, or let me throw in another white Willie Pete or white phosphorus and then make an adjustment off the next rocket. That's sort of how you would run an airstrike.
It is unclear exactly who first developed the idea to conduct tactical bombing in Laos using airborne FACs, but the initial men came from Project Water Pump, the U.S. Air Force's program to build and train the Royal Lao Air Force and Hmong. Eventually, these U.S. personnel were replaced by U.S. Air Commando combat controllers.
Volunteered for this operation, or whatever you want to call it, myself and Charlie Jones, who was a tech sergeant at the time. We didn't know much about what it was, other than the fact that it was going to be in Laos. It was highly, highly classified, and we were going to be directing airstrikes. That's about it.
They were forced to find a ride as best as they could, flying in Continental Air Services or Air America CIA proprietary aircraft, directing fighter strikes with smoke grenades or by describing the target area to the fighters. These aircraft were typically a Palladius Porter or Helio Courier. These initial FACs flew under the call sign Butterfly, and at first they were sent to Laos on a temporary duty status, soon changing to a permanent change of station. Occasionally flying with them and the pilot were a Hmong or Thai backseater to communicate with local ground elements. Ron Kosh soon followed Farmer, a Lao driver's license his only identification. Kosh using the call sign Butterfly 44 or 22, and directed approximately 60 airstrikes during his 3 months of temporary duty in Longcheng, Laos. Butterflies were flying in aircraft that did not have rocket pods, so pilots could not fire white phosphorus rockets to mark a target.
Mark our targets. We use smoke grenades, just conventional smoke grenades, which we which we essentially threw out the window of the aircraft onto what we wanted the target. And that was a reference point, whether we hit the target or not, but then use that as a reference point for the aircraft. The aircraft themselves were not armed, had no armament on them, no white phosphorus rockets or anything like that. Smoke was the only thing. We had no armor.
These young CCT FACs were creating the process on the go, discovering and pioneering.
When we got up there in Long 10, 20 alternate, we got in contact with John Garrity, who was an Air Force intelligence officer, and he, believe it or not, was doing directing all the airstrikes at the time. He went with us on a couple of missions, and then he went south and left us with it. So it was sort of make it up as you go along.
In all, less than 20 men directed airstrikes under the call sign Butterfly through early 1967. But they were still hampered by not being able to fly their own aircraft to and from the target area.
We were disappointed that we lost the mission, but it has to be said that facking out of a Platius Porter without any marking means other than throwing a smoke grenade out the window is not anywhere near like a military airplane with rockets under the wing. Besides, the war started heating up after that, and we might not have survived that. And those Platius Porters are not military airplanes.
Another reason for not liking the Helio Courier was that it did not have rockets. It did not have hard points on the wings. You were back to the same problem of marking targets by throwing smoke grenades out of the cockpit. The marking rocket allows you to stand off a mile and a half, several thousand feet.
In the spring of 1967, the 7th Air Force commander demanded that the existing non-pilot FACs be replaced by experienced qualified FAC pilots who were already flying and fighting in South Vietnam or from Thailand. These FACs became the Ravens, and they would have almost complete autonomy for choosing targets, most of them emerging targets of opportunity.
You talked about what the butterflies had been accomplishing. They did a lot of good, but this was a whole new scenario for, to have a FAC lead the airplanes under the clouds, mark the rocket, tell them how to get there, tell them the entry route and the exit route and how they were going to bomb there was a whole new thing for the mission up there.
Their mission was so hazardous, no U.S. Air Force pilots were ordered into the program. Rather, it was all volunteer. As the program was classified, American fighter pilots or FACs in Vietnam learned of the program by word of mouth or simply rumors.
Two of my instructors offered advice. One had been an A1 pilot, and he said when he went over there, make sure I take a manhole cover to sit on when I was flying. Another instructor said, you go there, fly your mission, come home in 12 months. Don't volunteer for the Mike program, and whatever you do, don't volunteer for the Raven program. And that's the first time I had heard of Raven forward air controllers. And more than once, probably a half dozen times, I flew in the back seat in OV-10, and we'd be up there on the plane to Jars. We'd be up at 4,000 or 5,000 feet. I can remember looking down and seeing an airplane, white wing with a red racing stripe, and who's that? No, that's a Raven. Just kind of put that in the back of my memory bank.
I spent full tour in Vietnam as a forward air controller in 01s, and I was always in trouble. I was just a notorious bad boy for flying too low, and full colonels were my favorite. I just give them a dose of crap they richly deserve. I got a message to see General Brown, 4-star, who was the head of 7th Air Force in Saigon. And I said, oh my God, they're going to rip captain's bars off and formally kick me out. General Brown came out in a T-shirt and exercise shorts. And he said, Captain Kavanaugh, I hear you about the meanest son of a forward air controller I have in the country. I just said, sir, I came here to fight the war, and it doesn't seem like anybody is on that same sheet of music. And he says, you're right. He said, I hear that you give them colonels a hard time. I said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, that's great. Any one of them gives you trouble, let me know. He said, I've got a mission for you. It's out country. He said, you'll have to take off your uniform. He said, you'll have to volunteer. He said, you don't have to do this. And I felt like it was giving me an offer I couldn't refuse. I said, I'd be honored.
Interestingly enough, all I had was a phone number at UDORN. Commanding officer said, you have some blue jeans, some civilian clothes? And I said, yes. Says, you won't need any more uniforms until you get stateside. And that was basically true. The first Raven I ever met has a nickname of Pepsi. I knew that he was landing, so I walked out to the ramp where he was parked. And here this guy comes out of a bird dog, eye patch across one of his eyes, playing a little squeeze music box as he's walking across the ramp.
Pilots were screened for the program to see if they had the moxie, courage, and skills to undertake this perilous mission. If accepted, they found themselves surrendering items tying them to U.S. service, such as uniforms and even checkbooks. They then crossed the so-called fence into forbidden Laos.
We had an American Embassy card and a Lao driver's license. And we left all our uniforms and military ID in a Connex container there in Udon. My commander, Lieutenant Colonel Abe Cardong, put me in his OV-10, flew me from Pleiku up to Udorn, and from Udorn, I went up to Vientiane for training, 5 days of training. I can remember the intel briefing there in Vientiane, the intel officer giving us briefing on who we were, what we're doing, and this and that, parameters, and asked me if he had any questions, and I paused momentarily. I said, okay, unmarked airplanes, no American military ID card. What's my cover story if I get shot down and captured? His response was, you don't have to worry about getting captured. And that was my intel briefing.
How did you interpret that?
I interpreted meaning that if we were shot down and lived, that if the enemy picked us up, that they'd kill us.
Yeah, we were so secret. We were secret from each other. We never knew the names of the CIA guys. They were Black Lion, Bagger. Everybody had a nickname. My name was 4A, and nobody knew my name. Mike, nobody knew my last name or anything about me. We didn't know each other. In the heat of combat, we didn't have time to chit-chat.
Over time, qualifications to be a Raven and other requirements changed, but the unrestrictive rules of engagement for Ravens remained the same.
The briefing was advertised at an Intel/ROE, or Rules of Engagement brief. Well, ROEs were not anybody's favorite thing. My last month in Vietnam in August, I had to take 4 ROE exams, 100-question closed book exams. During this briefing, the guy never talked about ROEs, so eventually I said, what are the ROEs? He looked at me and he said, can you do this job or not? And I said, why, yes, I can. And he said, those are the ROEs.
The primary base for Raven operations was the Valley of Long Cheng, just southwest of the Plain of Jars, where the Hmong loyal to General Vang Pao live, and the location of the Thai and CIA secret headquarters. A few Ravens would also fly out of Luang Prabang and southern Laos at Pak Se and Savannakhet, but there would only be a handful of Ravens in country at any one time. By 1970, this top secret base for the Hmong, Thai, and CIA, Long Cheng, would be the second largest city in Laos, with about 45,000 people and, based upon takeoffs and landings counted by a U.S. reporter, the busiest airport in the world by the late 1960s.
The height of the secret war, the CIA base at Long Chen reportedly had one of the busiest airports in the world. Hmong, Lao, and CIA pilots flew thousands of dangerous rescue and ground support missions.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam's invasion route into South Vietnam, ran through eastern Laos in close proximity to the Pak Se and Savannakhet-based Ravens, providing targets as the North Vietnamese tried to suffocate Laos.
I actually had a senior CIA officer down in MR4 that asked me one time, Lou, what are we doing here? So I said, well, we're protecting the Laos and their sovereignty against the North Vietnamese. And he said, well, yes, but we're also trying to tie up as many forces as possible here before they get to South Vietnam. We do that, by supporting the Laotians here, but we also are putting pressure on the trail, which I knew because we were doing team infills and that kind of stuff to put pressure on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He said we had tied up effectively 6 combat divisions in Laos that never made it to South Vietnam.
The first 2 Ravens arrived in Laos in July 1967. First Lieutenants Jim Lemon and Truman T.R. Young had been flying O-1 bird dogs along the demilitarized zone between South and North Vietnam, thacking fast-moving fighters. They also had flown missions from Vietnam, inserting and extracting U.S. Special Forces teams onto the Lao-Vietnam border. These Ravens flew U-17s, equivalent to the Cessna 180s, or the O-1 bird dogs, equivalent to the Cessna 150. And later, a few Ravens flew the T-28. Most who were to volunteer for the Raven program were young lieutenants or captains bold enough to take on this deadly mission. You might ask, why would FACs fly such slow, thin-skinned aircraft? Well, their mission was to fly low and slow to aid them in finding enemy targets. This, of course, made the Ravens more vulnerable to enemy fire and was one reason the mission was so dangerous. A normal Raven tour lasted approximately 6 months, and each greatly exceeded the maximum flying hours that Air Force rules in Vietnam specified because the mission dictated such, and there was no one to tell the Ravens not to, as they were a secret operation wrapped within a greater secret war. U.S. Air Force pilots there were prohibited from flying more than 110 hours per month, waivable to 140 hours per month. Raven pilots were busting this prohibition by flying up to 10 hours per day, quickly exceeding their monthly maximum.
And we flew anywhere from 2 to 3 sorties a day. Those are 3.5-hour sorties. And you get shot at on every one of them. You're pretty tired by the end of the day, whether you've flown 7 or 10.5 hours. Jay Johnson and I compared notes the other day looking at our logbooks, and we were flying 160 to 180 hours a month.
One of the problems was the Air Force required me to get an inspection on it every 100 hours. So I would take it down to UDORN for its 100-hour inspection. The problem is I was flying 10 hours a day. So, I had to go down certainly every 2 weeks, which left a hole up there since I was the only guy there.
In a day's work, if we had up to full strength, we'd have 5 guys flying 10 hours a day. For me, when I was flying the T-28, I flew 3 hours in the T-28 for dawn patrol. I flew the O-1 for 4 hours in the Plain de Jars, and then I would come back and fly dusk patrol right before sundown for another 3 hours, and that would give me my 10 hours.
The reason for the accelerated battle rhythm and vicious combat was that each dry season, starting in October or November, the North Vietnamese would attack with increased numbers of troops each year and push towards the Plain of Jars and into the Pak Se area to destroy the Royal Lao, Hmong, and Thai armies. U.S. air power supported these allied troops. The offenses reversed with the rainy season, starting around May, when particularly the Hmong would launch counter-offenses to push the North Vietnamese back, with the Ravens controlling airstrikes to support these offenses. Upon Craig During's first day, he was told to fly, learn the area, but not put in any airstrikes.
We landed, I got in the front seat of a bird dog, he got in the back seat, and we went out, and I put in some airstrikes. And then early afternoon, we came back, and he said, okay, you're free to go. But I'm going to give you the number 1 backseater, who is Yang B, and I just don't want you to put in any airstrikes. It's your first day. I said, okay, fine. Of course, as soon as we got airborne, Yang B's talking. He says, we have to go to Zhengdet right now. And I said, why? And he said, because if many enemy come, they are trying to overrun Zhengdet. And I said, well, we'll leave that for one of the other Ravens. He said, no, you're the only one airborne. And I called the radio operator, and he said, yeah, you are. And so I put in a set of A1s, second set of A1s, a set of F-105s, and a third set of A1s. And finally, we broke the attack. They gave us an estimated KBA, killed by air, of 200. I got a distinguished flying cross, and that was on my first day on the job. I said, whew. It was a pretty good foreshadowing of what was to come.
The Ravens' mission in detecting and guiding attack aircraft onto North Vietnamese forces inside Laos exposed them to deadly ground fire. Enemy weapon systems firing at the Ravens in Laos included AKs and other small arms. 12.7 millimeter, 14.5, and 37 millimeter. All were deadly to the O-1 or U-17 aircraft the Ravens flew. Any round hitting just the right spot on an aircraft can bring it down or kill the pilot, and often did. The T-28, which only a few Ravens flew, provided a bit more protection. Each day, Ravens would become airborne, flying low and slow over Lao terrain, playing a deadly cat and mouse game with the North Vietnamese below, trying to spot the enemy and bring fire upon him before their anti-aircraft artillery could shoot the Raven down. Each Raven learned the sounds of different enemy weapons firing to better protect themselves.
Yeah, you get it very quickly because you have plenty of opportunities to learn. And one of the reasons that we like to keep that window open is because we could hear the pop, pop, pop from the muzzle. The sound would come right into the cockpit. Each gun sounds different. And to me, it was the sound that told me. It wasn't the smoke, the muzzle flash, or anything like that. It was the sound that I heard. And I said, I know there's something out there. And I'd go find it. Interestingly enough, north of Mong Sui, there was a 51 caliber machine gun that worked on top of this hill. And we realized after a while that he couldn't hit anybody. He was terrible. Then we kind of came to the conclusion that maybe he didn't want to hit anybody, that he was just doing what he was told. We left the guy alone. When we fly by, we go boom, 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 and then keep going to whatever it is we wanted to do.
Eight rocket tubes were mounted on the wings, and each Raven had 3 radios. Good judgment and courage dictated how the Ravens operated in their daily missions. Ravens were given carte blanche authority to direct and approve target operations over their areas of operation. For the Ravens, there was no traditional rules of engagement, such as the ones used by all military pilots flying out of South Vietnam or Thailand. Virtually all decisions came from the Raven on the scene. They could choose which equipment to carry and chose their own call signs.
The 7x50 binoculars, and I'd fly with my left hand and hold the binoculars and look out the window. Most of us kept a little notebook in our sleeve. We had our uniforms made in Thailand. We wore anywhere from blue jeans. Most of us had camouflage tops and bottoms, sometimes a matching pair. I carried an AR-15, a .38 pistol, and also had a .45 caliber pistol and a bag full of hand grenades and extra ammo in case we had to spend some time on the ground. And our backseater was also armed with at least a small arm handgun.
Truman Young and I went downtown and had these uniforms made. We were told to have everything non-military. I kept my jungle boots and I wore them on all my missions. The uniform itself was plenty tough enough.
When I got to the Ravens, my good friend Papa Fox had Raven 4-4. All the Raven facts at 20 alternate were 4-0 facts, the boss being 4-0. Raven 4-6 was a guy that kind of checked me out on what was going on. And he said, you need to pick a number between 41 and 49. I said, I want to be Raven 44. And he said, that's a bad idea. He just got killed 2 days ago. The guy that took Papa Fox number got killed in, I think, the first week that he was there. So he said there's a lot involved, so it'll be too confusing. I said, well, if you're 4'6", I'll be 4'8", and I didn't realize that was going to be my name for the next 55 years, 4'8", and a lot of people only know me as 4'8", Raven 4'8".
This is what the Ravens loved about their job. They had the autonomy to make decisions and direct fires to kill the enemy, unlike in Vietnam.
Wonderful part of it being a Raven was we didn't have the uniforms on. There's no visual signs, no pecking order, was no I outrank you. None of that language ever happened. But we didn't have any rules, which was each individual found where he worked the best.
The Ravens would huddle with the CIA and Vang Pao each night to discuss targets for the next day's operations. They started the day with a list of scheduled fighter sorties coming into their area, and the Ravens decided among themselves which Raven would take off and when.
What we would do from day to day is we would talk about it the night before. And we'd look at the list of fighters that were getting ready to come up. We knew that 805 3 F4s were coming out of Udon, and at 918 there was 105s coming. And we knew that different airplanes could do different things, and they usually carried different ordnance. The A1s were fabulous because they could carry everything. And they had so much gas, they could orbit for a long, long time. The F4s were always coming in saying, well, we've only got 10 minutes we can give you. Quick, what do we do? Well, that was typical because that's the way the aircraft was built.
In the evening, discuss among the Ravens as well as with the CIA folks who would actually put the order in. We would sort of come to consensus of what the priority was. This target, that target, maybe something we were seeing we wanted to watch for a day or two more. But we would have lots of communication among ourselves about what we were seeing on the ground.
We were always on defense. And then in Laos, we were the hunters.
We would have hip pocket targets. In other words, I found some supplies. They're at these coordinates, and there's a trail walking in. I noticed I was very, very good at finding people. And other folks found guns. Other people found tanks and trucks. And my tactic was I flew high. And I looked way out in the distance with binoculars. And they felt that they were not in danger. And so they didn't run for cover. They'd see, oh, this airplane is going way over there. And I just kept going, man. I just kept moving, called up the fighters, and went back, kaboom. If you have trails, if they meander like this, they're animals. If they're straight, they're people. And so that's how you do is you keep going down the trail.
The Ravens maintained contact with an orbiting C-130 command post on station 24 hours per day that would direct fighters to the Ravens.
There is an airborne command post. They're sending airplanes to a certain area, and they arrive at Cricket. Cricket assigns them to whatever FAC is out there. If you're the clever FAC, you want to be sure that you always have something available in your hip pocket to take care of extra airplanes if there are any. And I had a lot of targets. All I had to do was organize them and be sure that I was applying the right kind of airplanes against the right kind of targets.
Ravens had to be particularly precise when directing fires during a troops in contact situation. Unlike attacking, say, an enemy vehicle formation, the fires had to be particularly tight and precise so as not to kill the friendly troops.
Troops in contact, and I had a lot of those, both with Yuvong Lee and down on the south side of the Plain des Jars. You need dedicated airplanes for that. You need to be sure that they're there for long enough to really understand the dynamic of the battle and where their bombs have to be and where they absolutely can't be. On the other hand, the Alpha Strike is coming back from North Vietnam. Got 16 aircraft. They've come a long way. They've left the tanker out over the Gulf of Tonkin, perhaps. They've come into North Vietnam. They're coming back out. They don't have much gas. You want to be able to get 16 aircraft on and off the target all within 2 or 3 minutes. This is not a time for chasing trucks or for troops in contact or for going after some predetermined target that's very, very important that we hit. This is a time for a target like a truck park. So I have lots of truck parks.
Each day, Ravens would become airborne, flying low and slow over Lao terrain, playing a deadly cat and mouse game with the North Vietnamese below, trying to spot the enemy and bring fire upon him before their anti-aircraft artillery could shoot the Raven down.
I flew from 1,500 feet. The main thing is to keep the airplane moving, so it didn't matter what altitude, as long as your airplane is keeping. Take your hands off the controls, use your feet, and just let the airplane kind of bounce around and straight and level for more than about 8 seconds. You're not a straight and level target. That was the secret to survival. I was blessed that sometimes I turned left and 37 millimeter came up on my right, and vice versa. I had to use my binoculars, and I used both hands as the airplane was bobbing up and down, and I could focus through the trees and spot trucks or wherever. It took me about 6 months in Vietnam to be able to use those binoculars to see well and really be a good forward air controller.
To give you an idea of the complexity of the Raven mission, they had to fly their aircraft with almost no navigational aids while looking for telltale signs of the enemy. That was difficult enough, but they also had to operate 3 radios, talking to an airborne control post, fighter aircraft, and ground assets, or each other. The Ravens often flew with Hmong observers, the backseaters, called robins, who provided the vital link with tribal ground forces operating under thick layers of jungle canopy.
Quite a few of us flew with backseaters, but not every flight. I flew with a backseater about 50% of the time. It really depended on what was going on. If we knew we were going to work with one of the Hmong units that were out in the field, we obviously would take a Robin with us because he would be our translator. They also know the area. They've walked a lot of that area, and they can pick up changes too. And all of them spoke good enough English that we could communicate back and forth. One gentleman by the name of Yang B was very senior, very good, spent a lot of time in the air, and he was by far my favorite backseater, but he was also the most experienced. If he was available, I would take him, but we had several other backseaters that were available to us, and I never had a bad one, really.
You had the option of flying with a backseater or alone, and some of the guys would fly alone. I liked having the backseater. First off, we got to all be pretty good friends. One of the friends I'm still friends with, he went on to pilot training and flew T-28s. Then he was a personal pilot for General Vang Pao. This was really an incredible experience. Plus, it allowed me to communicate with the people on the ground when they didn't speak English.
The North Vietnamese increasingly larger offensives each year wielded deadly combat and lots of Raven targets.
The T-28 only had 2 hours endurance. It just had less fuel, but it was faster. So the T-28 would take off first thing in the morning, and there were usually about 4 or 5 of us guys out of the 8 that were qualified in the T-28. We'd take off at dawn because what we wanted to do was catch the trucks out in the open before they had a chance to camouflage them, or the tanks or whatever's out there, or people. The pace actually picked up when we were under attack. You may have heard of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. During that period, the dry season was when they liked to push forward because they didn't bog down in the roads, with the rain. And they started launching these rockets into Long Chin, especially at night. And I can honestly remember I flew 100 hours in 12 and a half days. It was all combat flying. You flew what you had to do. On one mission, I had 8 rockets, 4 and 4. I had 8 sets of fighters, possibly as many as 32 airplanes, all assigned to me, stacked at different levels in different places. Listen, you guys, I got everybody on frequency, and I'm going to give you one briefing that I'm going to correct. You only get 1 rocket, because then I'm out. When I mark that target, I'll take the first guys in. The F-4s usually went first because they were the ones lowest on gas, and then the 105s. And the A-1s could stay all day. The T-28s were pretty long. Each flight got a rocket. It was pretty intense, pretty tiring. In fact, that's one of the few times when I would actually come back to rearm, not necessarily to refuel.
There was a road crossing on one of the routes coming into the PDJ, and the night before I mushed up the crossing point across the stream. And it paid off because the next morning I found 17 trucks backed up to the choke point. I knocked out the last truck and the first truck, and I had all day to knock out the 17 trucks. And several of them had secondary explosions. They were loaded with explosives, obviously. The defensive part of it is protecting General Vang Pao's troops that were on these mountaintops would go out and do missions to protect them.
The general was in his element, at a mortar position, in a foxhole, or in a plane directing fires. Vang Pao flew at least once with Bob Farmer and with Jim Lemon, but the CIA put a stop to that as Vang Pao was too valuable to be placed in a FAC aircraft that was being shot at.
And that's what Vang Pao and I were doing that day. We're putting in his Air Force, that's really what it was. It was the Lao T-28s, and then primarily flown by Lao pilots, not the Hmong pilot. We didn't have any of the Hmong pilots in the program in 67 that I'm aware of. The Lao pilots were doing a good job for him. After we put them in, he wanted to do some reconnaissance. He wanted to look around. He loved looking at the terrain from the airplane. He'd always looked at it from hillsides, and the CIA helicopters wouldn't take him out there. I can understand why. Eventually, we ended up over Xinguangville, a town that he had lived in. And that's where I think we picked up the bullet hole, 2 bullet holes actually. And after that, John prohibited him from flying with me. In other words, John didn't trust a lieutenant to be making life and death decisions with what really amounted to his whole mission up there. Without Vang Pao, there was nothing.
Laos became the most bombed country on Earth during the war due to the U.S. strategic decision to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a mission that was not the Raven mission as I outlined earlier in this video. The Ravens focused on North Vietnamese formations, attacking inside of Laos convoys, truck parks, artillery, and anti-aircraft sites. They directed precise munitions at close range upon these targets, a targeting process totally separate and distinct from the high-altitude saturation bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The FAC program in Laos lasted from 1966 to 1972. 192 U.S. Air Force officers served as Ravens, with 22 Ravens killed in action. No Raven was ever taken prisoner. However, their loss rate was near 12%, one of the highest for any Air Force unit during the war.
Toward the end of December, there had been, I think, about 16 Ravens in country at the 4 different operating locations. 4 had been in Pak Se. 3 of them were shot down on that day, the 23rd of December, 72. The next day, one of the Ravens up north was shot down and killed.
The December 23, 1972 combat was so calamitous that Hatch and fellow Raven Jack Shaw, who flew together that day, have called each other every single year on that anniversary, regardless of where they were in the world, to recount that day.
Started on the 21st with our SAR launch, and now the 22nd we spent all day policing the site, covering the guys, and then we escorted them. And then on the morning of the 23rd, originally I had been scheduled to fly over Saravan. Hal Mishler was going to fly an instructional sortie with Jack Shaw, who was just checking out in the area. He decided he wanted to fly a combat go over Saravan, so we swapped missions. He took my go to Saravan, and I took his flight with Jack Shaw. And while Jack and I are flying up in the Pak Song area, I get a call from Hillsborough saying the Raven 40's down. So I turned immediately. I knew the area better than Jack did. Jack was in the front seat. I was in the back seat, but I flew the aircraft because I could pick up a heading that I knew would get us right to Saravan. We come into the area and find out that Hal had been working a gun site. He got a hit, and the aircraft was on fire. The guy who was flying the airplane was Kaman, who was one of our best backseaters. We'd all flown with him, and we let him fly the aircraft and stuff, so he probably could have landed it. But the aircraft was on fire. Hal had been unconscious since the hit, hadn't shown any signs of life. And at about 300 feet, Kaman jumped, fell through a corrugated metal roof, and killed him. I started using the 4.2-inch mortar that they had just south of the runway to silence some of the guns, but we had at least one 37 shooting, at least one 23, and we had probably 5 different 12.7 millimeters. While we were working the area trying to determine if we could get any contact with them or anything else, that we determined from the ground commander that no, that Hal had died and that jumped from the aircraft. But by that time we'd taken a hit, I think from 12.7, and wound up getting ready to dead stick onto the runway at Saravan. I say runway, it was a grass strip, but World War II Japanese strip. Get on the helicopter and they take off, and the kicker starts motioning me over the door to get my gun and train it out the door, because enemy within a couple hundred meters to the north of us that were shooting at us as we came out of the LZ. So we went into the site and we picked up the wounded, and that's where the story that you see in the Ravens book comes in. We load several wounded on board, and they also bring on 2 bodies, and they're not in body bags, they're wrapped in cargo chutes. And that's where Jack writes about seeing the blood running up and down the cockpit and out the door. What Jack didn't know, and I knew that we were picking up the bodies of our crew and that they would be on board with us. I smoked a whole pack of cigarettes on the way back. But in the story that Chris Robbins did, he said that Jack did. Jack didn't smoke, I did. And when we got to Pak Se, Ken Ferguson, all of the CIA guys, came down and met us at the aircraft. Ken Ferguson came up and handed me an American flag. We got the word back that it had been a 37 millimeter that had apparently exploded underneath the nose, and shrapnel was through the lower half of Hal's body. What killed him was a head impact. After we put the American flag over Hal's body, and load them onto the CH-46. Jack says, "Who is that? Did we have a fighter pilot out there somewhere?" I said, "No, Jack, that was Hal." And he hadn't realized that it had been his best friend. They had been roommates at Thailand before they both came to the Raven program. They'd even taken R&R together to Hawaii, and were pretty close. So that was kind of a hard day for Jack.
The next day, I went and flew with one of my academy classmates, very close friend. I got to watch him die a little bit later on the PDJ, Grant Ewells. He was my checkout pilot. I flew with him a couple sorties, and then he blessed me to go fly by myself. I got there literally in the first week in January up in Longchen, and he was killed on the 11th of February.
The first month I was there, we had lost two just before I got there, one of whom was supposed to be me. And within 2 weeks, we lost two more. We went then for until close to the winter, we lost 1, 2, 3 in a row individually. And then Doc Russell, he was killed shortly after I left. And finally, it's starting to really build on you. And I guess they call it PTSD now. We didn't have such a term in those days.
Well, the unit held its first reunion in 1972 in San Antonio. They were famous throughout the Air Force. They were known as the Edgar Allan Poe Literary Society wine tasting conventions. The ability to get together once a year for this group with that special mission and the special ties that we had, it's enabled us to remember what happened because we renew it every year. And the other thing is, we have not, out of those 205 guys, have not had a single suicide. And unfortunately, a lot of other units can't say that. I think we come as close as you can come to the old British regimental system where you have a very small, tight-knit group that has a reunion and has a close tie, and we go every year to see each other.